All right, so not sure how we're gonna go this week. Which way we're gonna do it? Did anybody work on any sonnets or memorize anything or?
No, I'm in the middle of memorizing number 29, but I didn't get to finish it.
Oh, you picked 29. Which one was 29? Oh, that wasn't one we looked at. That's a different one, is it?
No, it's a different one.
Sonnet 29. What about anybody else? Does anyone have a sonnet they're looking at?
I haven't started yet.
No? Have you picked one, though, or not?
I looked at the ones you sent me, so I need to pick one of those. Pick one soon.
You can pick one of those or one of the 154 other ones, but
I know.
they're tough. I know it's pretty intimidating when you first start working on sonnets, because they like when you look at them, they're just like, I mean, I don't know, it just looks like a different language, I guess. You kind of read these sonnets, you're like, what the hell is going on in these things? I know when we started working on the sonnets with Robert, because we're doing vocal exercises every day, and one of them is to use a cork, which I think most people probably heard of, or maybe not. But you put a cork between your teeth, just not long ways, just sideways, and speak with the cork in your mouth, and it works your lungs, but it also helps with pronunciation, all kinds of different things. So I would just read the sonnets with the cork in my mouth. So that's what I was doing every morning. I just, 15 minutes, I would just read, one sonnet after the other. And a lot of times it didn't make any sense, but the more you read through them, things would, usually what happens with a sonnet is you'll read it and one or two lines will make sense. You'd be like, oh, I like those two lines. and then you got to figure out what the rest of the sonnet means. But, so yeah, I was doing that for a while, and I think just the more you read them and kind of just get used to them. But I think it's the same with any Shakespeare. It's just the more you work on it, it's like being able to sight read music. It just takes a certain amount of work, but then once you've done that work, you can kind of pick up Shakespeare and look at it and understand a good chunk of it. You wouldn't necessarily get all of the nuances and stuff first time you read it, but you generally at least have a good idea of what's being said. So if you're intimidated, that's good.
Okay.
Yeah. I remember when we used to walk around with the corks in our mouth and be drooling everywhere.
Yeah, I think Nate was the worst, wasn't he?
Carrying that good.
Yeah. That's the other thing. You will drool when you start using the cork, and don't worry, but that's normal. But yeah, all the different vocal exercises are fun. And unfortunately, I haven't been doing any of them lately because I've been lazy. But anyways. So what about you, Job? Have you been looking at any sonnets?
No, not lately.
No,
I need to get back into it.
You're a bum.
Yeah. A good Shakespearean insult.
No, let me look one of them up. I'll get back to you. It's usually a Shakespearean insult, usually like 20 different words, right?
Yeah, you can call me a toad or something.
Did you say try to say this with cork in your mouth? Is that what you were saying?
Yeah, actually, it's something that apparently the Greeks used to do. They used to put stones in their mouth, and yeah, although I think they actually put it fully in their mouth, but and there is an exercise you can do with the cork where you put the cork fully in your mouth, but it's generally better to do that singing, not speaking, because speaking with a cork in your mouth just generally makes you gag and you want to throw up. So, but yeah, you put the cork between your teeth. And just kind of hold it in your mouth. You got to be careful though because it's very easy to clench your jaw with the cork in your mouth. But yeah, it's just a matter of speaking through the cork and fighting for speech clarity while you've got the cork in your mouth. Because when you first start with it, it just sounds like gobbledygook and there's drool coming out and yeah. But as you work with it, you build up builds up your lung capacity and, you know, forces your breathing to become just better and deeper. And yeah, it's a very useful exercise. People can try it. It's definitely fun. And then when you add it to, like, if you're going for a walk and you put the cork in the mouth and you walk and recite sonnets, and like the walking at the same time as doing it, because you're using your lungs for two different things at the same time, it has an even different effect. It also has the effect that anybody walking on the street near you thinks you're pretty weird. You get many a funny look. So, anyways, but let's get on to these sonnets. So we looked at a group of sonnets last week. Does everyone have the PDF or the link to the PDF?
Yeah.
If not, I am posting it in the group chat box. People should be able to see
It's the
that.
same as last week, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Well, and I guess Avneet, you're the only one that was on last week. Actually, sorry, I just remembered that Ned still hasn't gotten on, and I don't know where he is, so we'll just have to go without him. Alright, well, actually, maybe if you want to do it, Avneet, you want to look at Sonnet 29? Or not? It's up to you.
Okay.
You want to look at
I
it?
don't mind. Sure.
I'll
have to open it.
Yeah, do people have the ability to pull up Sonnet 29?
Yes.
Okay. And Jen and Job, you can stay unmuted if you want, as long as there's not a whole bunch of noise in the background.
Okay.
John's just muted because he's got a bunch of background noise. Ooh, Sonnet 29 is a good one.
I'll try. Oh, there we go. Okay.
And wait, so Sonnet 29 is not in this PDF, though, right?
No. Do you have an ability to pull it up, John?
I have another list of them. I'll check that.
Okay.
Let me know. I'll wait till John pulls it up and.
Okay.
Yeah, you can go ahead. It'll take me a minute here.
Okay.
Okay. Sonnet number 29. When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state, and trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries, and look upon myself and curse my fate, wishing me like to one more rich in hope, featured like him with friends possessed, desiring this man's art and that man's scope, with what I most enjoy contended least. Yet, in these thoughts myself almost despising, haply I think on thee. And then my state, like to the lark at break of day arising from sullen earth, sings hymns at heaven's gate. For thy sweet love remembered such wealth brings, that then I scorn to change my state for kings.
Cool. So do you have any, does anyone have initial thoughts on this, or maybe Avneet, any particular reason why you picked this one?
I wanted to find one on love. So I browsed a few, and I found this one.
And also, this is one of the ones that was done in that series.
What, the playing Shakespeare, or?
Yeah, they did that one, or at least some of it.
Yeah, I think they did.
I still have to watch those. I'll watch them this week.
They're great. I haven't watched them for a while, but they are, they're addictive, actually. Very good. All right. Well, let's kind of do some of what we did at the end of last week's session. Let's look at the iambic, and then let's look at we'll look at the monosyllabic words versus the polysyllabic. Actually, although I guess first of all, let's discuss the general sense of it as we have right now. So, do you maybe want to discuss what it's about, Avneet? Other people can kind of chime in.
Well, it's about somebody who is in love, but is also pitying in a self-pitying mode. Is into self-pity, like, oh, poor me. I have no wealth. I have no friends, and is jealous of other people's friends. But when he realizes what he has in his love, in the person he loves, he kind of breaks out of his self-pity, like where he says, like to the lark at break of day, right, arising from sullen earth. Mm-hmm. Where he snaps out of it, and then he realizes that I wouldn't when I realize that I have you, I wouldn't even change my place with kings. Mm. I think that's it.
Yeah, it's a pretty powerful shift to go from this, I'm all alone, I beweep my outcast state, and I look upon myself and curse my fate, to this, then I scorn to change my state with kings. It's pretty serious shift. All right, let's read through it on the iambic. Now, is everyone clear on the iambic? I know Job should be. I'm not sure about John and Jen. We've worked on iambic with the Schiller work. Shakespeare's is a little bit more strict than the Schiller translations we were using before, but so maybe I'll just go over it quickly, and then Avneet can read it in iambic, and we'll go from there. So the iambic pentameter, pent being 5, an iamb being a foot. So 5 feet per line is the meter that the sonnet is written in. Now a foot is just 2 syllables basically, and an iamb is a dedum, so it's a unstressed, stressed syllable. So your iamb is your foot, or your iambic. God, this is always so annoying. So yeah, your iamb is your foot, but it's a unstressed stress. You have trochaic and you have different types of feet, but in this case it's an iambic foot. So, when in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes. So because it's pentameter, 5 feet, and each foot has 2 syllables, it's 10 syllables per line. And in the case of these sonnets, and in the case of some of Shakespeare's plays, actually Richard III, when we look at that, and we're going to start on that next week, one of the things that's interesting about Richard III is that Shakespeare is very strict to the iambic meter in that play. In later plays like Macbeth and things like that, he gets, he starts breaking it more and more, but in Richard III, he's very strict to the meter. So every line in your sonnet has 10 syllables. And the meter that it's written in, just like you would say 4/4 or whatever in music, it's written in this beat of da dum da dum da dum da dum da dum. Now the other thing with the sonnets is to realize that there's 3 quatrains, so 3 lots of 4 lines. And that's also something that Shakespeare is fairly strict to, that I haven't looked at tons of Keats and other people, but in Shakespeare there's oftentimes very distinct quatrains and shifts in thoughts with each new quatrain. This one breaks it a little bit, just a little bit. And then you have your rhyming couplet at the end. And of course, the other thing is the rhyming structure that you have. This is something else we discussed last week. So inside each of those quatrains, every second word rhymes. So in the case of Sonnet 29, eyes, cries, state, fate. And then the second quatrain, hope, scope, possessed, least. Possessed? Least, maybe? This is where we begin to realize that our pronunciations of words was different to Shakespeare's times. Despising, arising, state, gate, and then the last couplet, brings kings. So the couplet, rhyming couplet, is the way he ends it. So I'll just say that to begin with, and then as we go through this sonnet, we'll look at things, because the thing with setting up a meter, with setting up a rhythm, de-dum, 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 and this is something that gets discussed in the Playing Shakespeare, in the Playing Shakespeare series as well, is that, and even the other person, Ben Crystal, who wrote the Shakespeare on Toast, he's a young guy that's pretty prominent in the Shakespeare scene in England at the moment. But he makes the point that that Shakespeare's setting up this rhythm so that he can break it, because it's the breaking of the rhythm which is what the human mind doesn't respond to monotony. It responds to change and provocations and things that don't quite the juxtapositions of words and paradoxes and things like that. So you can't just go de-dum, when in disgrace with fortune's end, men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state, right? And the mind just goes, oh, I'm going to take a nap. So the rhythm gets set up so that you can break it, and this is what we'll call an inversion, and it's something that largely exists in the first words of your iambic lines, where the first word might be emphasized. So instead of going de-dum, it would go dum-de. So we'll look at that as we go. But let's just read this sonnet through in a strict iambic. So Nate, do you want to do that?
Ooh, okay.
Or someone else can volunteer if you don't want to do it. But you should, since you're going to work on this sonnet. So go for it.
Okay, I shall make the effort. Can you give me Can you guide me a bit? I'm really rusty.
Yep. And you just want to overemphasize it, and you can take your time. So, when in disgrace with fortune end men's eyes, I all alone.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. When in disgrace with fortune end men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state, and trouble death heaven with my bootless, or is it bootless is one?
Yeah, well, this is one of those trouble lines. We came across a few of these last week, right?
Right.
And if for reading Shakespeare, you probably noticed that in places he'll, instead of writing it is, it'll say tis, or instead of over, it'll say o apostrophe er, and the v will be missing. So Shakespeare's cutting down the number of syllables in a word to make it match the iambic structure. And this is one of those lines where you have to kind of look at it and figure out, well, is, like, for example, is trouble, you could say trouble, or you could just say trouble, and it's kind of a shorter thing. And then similar, like heaven is a word where Shakespeare will sometimes use it as 2 syllables, sometimes use it as 1. So it could be heaven, or it could be heaven.
Right.
And so this one I would lean towards and trouble, deaf, hev, and trouble, deaf, hev, and with, and trouble, deaf, and trouble, deaf, hev, and with my bootless cries. Yeah, it's tough.
Right. and trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries, and look upon myself and curse my fate, wishing me like to one more rich in hope. Featured, I guess featured is just one, or featured.
Yeah, featured.
Okay.
Just for Ned, who I think joined. Ned, we're on Sonnet 29.
Featured like him, with sense possessed, desiring this man's art and that man's scope, with what I most enjoy contented least. Yet in these thoughts myself almost despising, haply I think on thee, and then my state, like to the lark at thee, break off they.
There's no thee, like to the lark at.
Oh, right. I'm reading my own copied handwriting. I don't know why I wrote thee. Okay. Like to the lark at break of day arising, from sullen earth sings hymns at heaven's gates. For thy sweet love remembered such wealth brings, that then I scorn to change my state with king.
All right, good. So did anybody notice any places in there, and in particular looking at the first words of the lines, where you would switch, where you do an inversion? Where it doesn't seem to make sense to go dee-dum, that you would be more inclined to stress that first syllable.
Can you repeat that, sorry?
Yeah, just if people noticed as you were reading that, whether there was places where it didn't seem to make sense at the start of the lines, where it seemed like it just, whether there's lines, instead of going dee-dum, if it made more sense to go dum-dee.
In featured?
Mm.
Because you wouldn't say featured, you'd say featured.
Yeah, definitely.
Also in heaven, it seems like it's kind of in the middle of the line, but if you just follow the iambic, it would be in trouble, deaf, heaven, which doesn't make sense.
Yep.
Say heaven.
And trouble, deaf, heaven, and trouble, deaf, heaven with my bootless cries. Yeah, I think that's when we kind of stopped and discussed. My thought would be that you would just do the trouble as, so, and trouble, deaf, heaven with my bootless cries. That we would contract trouble. That's probably what I would go for, but yeah, I think you could, and trouble, deaf. Because, yeah, I think the emphasis has to fall on the h of heaven. And trouble, deaf, heaven. Because otherwise, if you went and trouble, deaf, then deaf is getting, I don't know, you're saying deaf heaven, so you probably do need to hear the deaf. Because you're not just saying heaven, you're saying that heaven's deaf, so. And trouble, deaf, heaven, and trouble, deaf, heaven with my bootless cries. Yeah, it's funny though, because then it's almost hard to give heaven emphasis when you shrink it like that. But yeah, I think that's something like that, you know, you would have to really think about and make a decision on. But that's definitely a troublesome area right there. And that's where things like, just kind of breaking a sonnet down and looking at the iambic and things like that, you begin to become aware of these places that can trip you up in a sonnet. And you have to make specific choices, and you try it one way, and if you can't get it to work, then you say, okay, well, let me try it. Let me try my other hypothesis and see if I can get that to work. Is there any other inversions?
Nope.
You guys are all blind. Let's look at, okay, read to me the first word of every line.
How about happily?
That's, yep.
Wouldn't be happily, be happily.
Yeah. And particularly in the context of what you're saying, right? Yet in these thoughts, myself almost despising, haply I think on thee. So you would lean on the
Right.
hap, right?
Yeah.
Yep, definitely. Yeah, versus, yet in these thoughts, myself almost despising, haply I think on thee.
What about the like in the to the lark? Like you wouldn't say like two. That would say.
Yep. Yep, I think that's definitely one way you would use the first word. Like to the lark. And like's always important, because if you think of any type of metaphor or similes in general, the word like is one of the key terms when a lot of Shakespeare's, actually also in Chapman's Homer, I think it's in the Iliad, he always, I can't think of it off the top of my head, but he's always setting up these kind of descriptions things. So he'll say, as this, and this, so is this. So you always kind of have to use the words that, yeah, so happily I think on thee, and then my state, right? Then my state is like the lark at break of day arising from sullen earth. So you got to hear the like, because you're knowing that he's making a comparison. So yeah, definitely like.
Mhm.
Any others?
His featured one, it looks kind of similar to that one, like to the lark, where it's, I guess you would emphasize him, but it doesn't seem like it'd be featured like him.
Isn't it? I think that's the one Avneet already pointed out, isn't it?
Oh, did
Yeah.
she? Oh, sorry.
Okay. You obviously were not listening to me.
All right. All right, Job, read me the first word of every line.
Uh-oh.
Just read them.
When I and wishing, featured, desiring, with, yet, happily, like, from, for, and that.
So on any of those words, did you put the emphasis on the first syllable?
Featured and happily.
Yep, there's at least one more in there.
Wishing.
Yeah.
Wishing. Ah, right.
And that's one of the easiest ways to do it, is just deliberately go and look at the first word of every line. You're like, when? No. I? No. End. Wishing. Oh yeah, wishing. Featured, desiring, it's on the desire. With, yet, happily. Okay, happily. Like. And then in the case of like, you would want to look at the context that it's in and kind of make your decision. From, for, that. So, yeah. So you definitely got a few in there. So, Avneet, can you just read it again on the iambic?
Sure.
You can go a little faster if you want, but if it doesn't feel,
Right.
whatever you want to do.
When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state, and trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries, and look upon myself and curse my fate, wishing me like to one more rich in hope, featured like him, with friends possessed, desiring this man's art and that man's scope, with what I most enjoy contended least. Yet in these thoughts myself almost despising, haply I think on thee, and then my state, like to the lark at break of day arising, from sullen earth sings hymns at heaven's gate. For thy sweet love remembered such wealth brings, that then I scorn to change my state with kings.
Great. Now, do you want to just read it through normally, as you would, to give it actual sense? And in this case, you can obviously use those, be conscious of where those inversions are.
Okay. When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state, and trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries, and look upon myself and curse my fate, wishing me like to one more rich in hope, featured like him, with friends possessed, desiring this man's art and that man's scope, with what I most enjoy contended least. Yet in these thoughts, myself almost despising, haply I think on thee, and then my state, like to the lark at break of day arising, from sullen earth sings hymns at heaven's gates. For thy sweet love remembered such wealth brings, that then I scorn to change my state with kings.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting the way that the, like, just even featured and the happily, it's like a completely different music when you emphasize those words. They just stand out versus the other stuff. Now it's interesting, we discussed, because we had looked at some of these sonnets last week that started in when, and I pointed out to people that out of all of Shakespeare's sonnets, the grouping of sonnets that all start with the same word, the majority of them, sonnets that start with the word when, there's way more of them than any other word. And it's interesting because when he uses this word when, it's already designating a place in time, or a sense of that there's, you're saying when this happens, then this happens, or when I do this, then I do that. So there's always, when you say when, there has to be not a rebuttal, but there's it's like a response that has to come to it. So when I do this, and when I do that, and when I do this, then this happens. And so this sonnet has that to it. And he's conscious of where the shift happens. So there's an initial build that when this, so when in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, and then all of what comes after has to do with that, when I'm in this state, this outcast state. So the question I have is, where's the shift? Where does it move? And it's not super distinct in this one, but it is there. There's a shift that's taking place. In some of the other sonnets, it literally is as obvious as the first two quatrains start with the word when, and then the third quatrain starts with the word then. But not as obvious in this one.
Number 12 is like that. That's the one I was working on.
I was just flicking to that one, Job.
When I do count the clock, it tells the time.
Yeah, right. That's one that starts, when, and then literally the third quatrain starts, then of thy beauty. I guess the other way to think of it is in terms of the thought content, or where the thought is driving to, and then where a new thought comes in. And something, actually, it depends on what version you're looking at here in terms of punctuation. But the one that I just looked at, my punctuation kind of points it out to me. It's where the first thought somewhat ends, and then another thought comes in. And it's on that third quatrain. So that the first two quatrains are one idea that is driving through to this shift. Right, so when in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state. Thought hasn't ended, that's not the end of a sentence, right? And trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries, and look upon myself and curse my fate, wishing me like to one more rich in hope, featured like him with friends possessed, desiring this man's art and that man's scope, with what I most enjoy, contented least. That's all one long sentence, pretty much, one thought. And then it shifts, and as I said, it's subtle in this, because he's saying, when all this is happening, with what I most enjoy, contented least. Yet, in these thoughts, myself almost despising, happily I think on thee, and then, right, there's that word then, and it comes up a couple of times here, right, and then my state, like to the lark at break of day, arising from sullen earth, sings hymns at heaven's gate. What was he doing before with heaven? Heaven comes up twice in this sonnet.
Ah, right. He was troubling heaven.
Yeah, with what? With bootless cries, right?
Right, yeah.
So initially,
and moaning.
Yeah, exactly. So there's this massive, and that's a big counterpoint. So you've got, because initially saying, trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries, but now I'm like the lark and I sing hymns at heaven's gate. No longer bootless cries, hymns. For thy sweet love remembered, such wealth brings, that then I scorn to change my state with kings. Yeah. So when you see the word when, you always got to look for the then. Like something changes. And as I said, this one's not as distinct as, say, Job's Sonnet 12, where literally it's just when, then. This one's not so distinct. You could almost say, well, is it really the shift on the yet in these thoughts, or is it and then my state? But there's definitely something happening in the mind of this individual, right? Because it's the beginning of it's pretty kind of depressing, right? He's pretty demoralized and depressed, but then there's this shift, and that shift has to come through even in the musicality as well. So I just thought I'd point those couple of things out. Anybody else got any observations or thoughts? Alright, well if not, let's take a look at monosyllabic words versus polysyllabic.
Okay.
And who wants to explain what that is?
which have more than one syllable in it. Like, I think despising has 3. Despising.
Mhm.
So that is polysyllabic, but words like and, that, heaven, or trouble, those are which have one syllable.
Yep.
One sound.
Correct. And
Those
what did we? Do you remember what we discussed about when you run into a series of monosyllabics?
Oh yeah, then you have to have equal emphasis on all of them.
Well, yeah, you don't have to, but when you have a series of monosyllabic words, the iambic rhythm gets kind of thrown off, and you have to make a conscious decision as to how you're going to navigate through them. In a lot of cases you can. A lot of cases you can kind of give them equal emphasis and kind of drive through them. But it's something that you have to always be conscious of, is where these 3 or more monosyllabic words in a row, because it'll trip you up. And I mentioned this last week, that when you watch a Shakespeare performance and these actors are speaking, and next thing you're like, what are they saying? I'm confused. I lost them. They're getting tongue-tied or something. 9 times out of 10, it's because they've come against monosyllabic words and they're not conscious of it, and they just trip them up. And it's a strange thing, but it's there, and it's something to be conscious of. So one of the exercises to help become conscious of that, obviously, one of the first things you want to do is you want to kind of go through and mark out the iambic in the sonnet that you're working on. And then the next thing you want to do is go in and actually mark out where there's 3 or more monosyllabic words all in a row. But an exercise for it, just like with the iambic, where you'd read, when in disgrace with fortune end men's eyes, there is an exercise on the monos versus the polys that helps you hear them. So when in, and the idea in this exercise is you just kind of give an equal emphasis to the monosyllabic words and inflect the polysyllabics. So when in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state, and trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries, and look upon myself and curse my fate, wishing me like to one more rich in hope, featured like him with friends possessed, desiring this man's art and that man's scope, with what I most enjoy, contented least. Yet in these thoughts myself almost despising, haply I think on thee, and then my state, like to the lark at break of day, arising from sullen earth, sings hymns at heaven's gate. For thy sweet love remembered, such wealth brings that then I scorn to change my state with kings.
Good heavens.
So that's not so easy to do. It becomes difficult, but it makes you very conscious of, you're like, whoa, that whole last line is, actually the whole rhyming couplet is monosyllabic words except for the word remembered. You're like, well, maybe remembered's important. Maybe I better remember to make sure I use the word remembered. But it is interesting, because some sonnets, actually I was looking at a sonnet earlier in the week, I can't remember which one, but I counted it, it had, I think, 12 polysyllabic words in the whole sonnet.
And sometimes he pronounce, sometimes a word that might be three syllables, he'll pronounce it, he'll make it into two to get it to work.
Yep. Yeah, correct. One of the things, like the words that end in ed, contented, remembered, sometimes it would be remembered, or not contented, that's a bad example. Possessed. Who's all the noise coming from? Is that you, John, maybe? I'm not sure. So yeah, sometimes they'll be dropped down. Did anything stand out when I read it that way versus maybe stuff that you hadn't noticed before?
They had one example in the series Golden Rock or something, and it's just, the ed was pronounced separately.
Yep. All right. You want to just read it through one last time, Avneet, and then we'll take a look at another
Does somebody else want to do it?
Good idea. Jennifer? Oh, where's Jen? What about Job?
All right, I can do it.
Go for it.
One second. When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state, and trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries, and look upon myself and curse my fate, wishing me like to one more rich in hope, featured like him with friends possessed, desiring this man's art and that man's scope, with what I most enjoy contented least. Yet, in these thoughts myself almost despising, happily I think on thee, and then my state, like to the lark at break of day arising, from sullen earth, sings hymns at heaven's gate, for thy sweet love remembered such wealth brings, that then I scorn to change my state with kings.
Alright, I'm going to have you read it once more, Job. Watch out for your downward inflections.
Okay.
So just remember that whole first two quatrains, it's one thought that is kind of building and building, right? It's building to this point where and it's not just that he's saying, I'm in disgrace with fortune in men's eyes, people don't like me, I'm kind of an outcast here, and, I all alone beweep my outcast state. But this line with what I most enjoy, contented least. So the things that I love the most, I am getting the least sense of being content out of, right? And I think so everything before that line is building to that line, and that line's a pretty big deal, because it's not just that, he's in this disgrace, but he's most upset by the fact that the things that he loves the most, he's contented the least with. And this is where this is where you begin to kind of really break with all of the punctuation that's on the page. Right, like this has got a comma at the end of every line, at least in the copy I'm looking at. But in some cases you'd want to scrap that, in other cases But yeah, I think the first thing is the sense that it's kind of building like that, and I think this, and it's interesting.
'Cause that's right.
Huh?
Shift.
Yeah. Right
Yeah, because that's right before the shift in the third quatrain.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing you can use to build it is those inversions, right? Because it's the second quatrain that starts with inversions, right? And look upon myself and curse my fate. That could be the end of the thought there, right? You could just say, and look upon myself and curse my fate. Yet in these thoughts, myself almost despising. You don't really need that whole quatrain in between. Except that it develops the state of mind that he's in so much more detail. And it launches with this wishing me like to one more rich in hope, featured like him. So it's more, that second quatrain is even more emotional than the first one. He's kind of getting really worked up, right? And I want this man's art and that man's scope. And it all comes to this final part with what I most enjoy, contented least. And then it switches. Anyway, try it again, just for the hell of it.
Okay. When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state, and trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries, and look upon myself and curse my fate, wishing me like to one more rich in hope, featured like him with friends possessed.
Sorry, try those two lines again. You're not using the inversions. I don't know whether you can hear it or not. I guess the thing was to, just inflect those words. Wishing me like to one, featured like him. Just,
Okay.
they're the crucial ones. Anyway, I'm just being picky.
Start there or just at the beginning?
Yeah, sure. Go back to the beginning.
Okay. When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state, and trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries, and look upon myself and curse my fate, wishing me like to one more rich in hope, featured like him with friends possessed, desiring this man's art and that man's scope, with what I most enjoy contented least. Yet in these thoughts, myself almost despising, haply I think on thee, and then my state, like to the lark at break of day arising, from sullen earth, sings hymns at heaven's gate, for thy sweet love remembered such wealth brings, that then I scorn to change my state with kings.
Yeah, I think the word scorn is pretty important. That then I scorn. It has to have a scorning tone to it. Anyways, did people notice how different, I don't know, did it sound different once he inflected featured?
Yeah, it did. Sure did. That was definitely helpful.
It sounded completely different, and the next couple lines after it took on a completely different sense, and they're much more powerful. But
Yeah.
yeah. I mean,
it does make sense what you were talking about, where it's building up kind of this frustration right before the shift in the third quatrain.
Yeah.
Desiring this man's art, that man's scope, with what I most enjoy, contented least.
Yeah, it's definitely a fun sonnet. Alright, but let's look at another one. Let's look at one of the ones from the PDF, if everyone has that. Now, we looked at a bunch of these last week. Just trying to think which ones we didn't look at. Actually, for the fun of it, oh, hold on, maybe not. I was going to say, this Sonnet 15, if people, does everyone have the PDF? Ned, do you have the PDF? We haven't heard of anything from Ned yet. Hopefully he can hear us. Well, anyway, but yeah, Sonnet 15, there's another example of these when, then sonnet. The first quatrain starts with when, second quatrain starts with when, the third one starts with then. So, you know, again, it's kind of building to this shift. I'll just read it through. It's a fun sonnet. When I consider everything that grows, holds in perfection but a little moment, that this huge stage presenteth naught but shows, whereon the stars in secret influence comment. When I perceive that men, as plants, increase, cheered and checked even by the self-same sky, vaunt in their youthful sap, at height decrease, and wear their brave state out of memory, then the conceit of this inconstant stay sets you, most rich in youth, before my sight, where wasteful time debateth with decay, to change your day of youth to sullied night. And all in war with time, for love of you, as he takes from you, I engraft you new. It's a very simple kind of sonnet structure. When, then. Just, I don't know, it's very interesting. And then, of course, Sonnet 64, every second line starts with when. It just keeps building and building and building. Does anyone have a particular one they want to look at here?
Is good. It's not in the PDF, but it's sort of similar.
66. Let's have a look. Oh, yes, 66. Yeah, 66 has like 4, 8, 10 lines that start with the word end.
We read this, Joanne, a couple of weeks ago when we first did sonnets.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, that's a challenging one.
Mhm.
Alright, well, if no one has a preference from one on this sheet, then I might just pick one.
Go for it.
Alright, let's look at... Oh, they're all so good. Let's look at Sonnet 5.
Yeah, last time also we had discussed how the word time is in capital. It's capital letter.
Mm.
All these sonnets where it's a noun, and even in this one, the hours, it's a noun.
That's right.
And all these sonnets, I don't have my notes that I used last week, but you know, all these adjectives with time that he uses, like time's tyranny, or swift-footed time, old time. They're really interesting. Never resting time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Shakespeare loves time. Definitely very conscious of it. In a lot of cases, it's a consciousness of, you know, the time that gives is also time that takes. That it gives life, but it destroys it. I guess, you know, it is the sense that from the minute that you're born, you're you know, every minute that passes is a minute closer to your death. It's yeah, it's scary when you think about it that way. But Shakespeare definitely did, and everything, you know, this idea that anything that's young and beautiful is going to grow old. It's going to get past its prime.
Yeah, you know, it's like the what Helga was talking about with the Anania, that you know, beauty dies, everything that's beautiful dies. So that was the first line of Schiller's the poem there.
Hmm. Someone want to read this sonnet? I guess Ned, are you actually on here?
Yes, Joanne, I'm here.
Oh, you are. There you are. How's it going? Have you got any thoughts or comments, or you want to read this next sonnet?
No, I think today I should
Just listen.
Listen and find the direction of your discussion here.
Okay.
I've been absent for several weeks, so.
Which one is this now? 5 or are we back to?
Yeah, 5. Sonnet 5. All right, Job or Avneet, you guys want to read it?
I can read it.
Okay.
Sonnet 5. Those hours that with gentle work did frame the lovely gaze where every eye doth dwell, will play the tyrants to the very same, in that unfair which fairly doth excel. For never resting time leads summer on to hideous winter, and confounds him there, sap-checked with frost and lusty leaves quite gone, beauty o'ersnowed and bareness everywhere. Then, were not summer's distillation left, a liquid prisoner pent in walls of glass, beauty's effect with beauty were bereft, nor it, nor no remembrance what it was. But flowers distilled, though they with winter meet, leaves but their show, their substance still live sweet.
There's actually Sonnet 6 that is kind of a follow-on to this Sonnet 5. I'll just read it quickly so people have a sense, because so Sonnet 6 says, then, it's one of these, this is a sonnet that starts with the word then. Then let not winter's ragged hand deface in thee thy summer, ere thou be distilled. Right, and so in Sonnet 5, he's talking about, you know, time leading summer on to winter, and how flowers distilled, though they with winter meet, though they get destroyed by winter, they're only leasing their show, their substance still lives sweet. So he's saying, then let not winter's ragged hand deface in thee thy summer, ere thou be distilled. Make sweet some vial, treasure thou some place with beauty's treasure, ere it be self-killed. That use is not forbidden usury, which happy's those that pay the willing loan. That's for thyself to breed another thee. Or 10 times happier, be it 10 for 1. 10 times thyself were happier than thou art, if 10 of thine 10 times refigured thee. Then what could death do, if thou shouldst depart, leaving thee living in posterity? Be not self-willed, for thou art much too fair to be death's conquest, and make worms thine heir. So it's,
which one was this again?
That's Sonnet 6. And I think this is probably a case where these sonnets actually were written like as a pair. Because they are so connected. So it's just interesting because Sonnet 5 is kind of just more this like almost like a statement of fact. And it's like, oh, okay, that's a very interesting, that's a very fascinating point. But then this Sonnet 6 comes in, and then he's like, yeah, but you got to remember that just like time destroys, summer and winter and kills the flowers, it's going to do the same thing to you, buddy. So you need to have 10 kids before death takes you away. But again, these are these earlier sonnets that I think I mentioned this last week. It's thought, and there's a fair amount of evidence that there was a whole grouping of sonnets that Shakespeare wrote for the Earl of Southampton, who was his first patron. I think he dedicated one of his poems, either Venus and Adonis or the Rape of Lucrece, I think was dedicated to the Earl of Southampton. So there's a fair amount of evidence that these were sonnets written to Southampton, who at the time was being told that he had to marry. Southampton, I think, grew up in the house of the Cecils, who were one of the main, they were Queen Elizabeth's advisors. They were advisors throughout Queen Elizabeth and James I. And between there's Robert Cecil and William Cecil. I can never remember which one's the father and the son, but between the two of them, they basically ruled England for like 50 or 60 odd years.
William was the father, I think.
Okay, there you go. So Hampden was taken into William's household and was raised in his household. And part of the deal was that when that happened, the head of the household chose who you married. They were basically you basically kind of owed them. And so William Cecil was trying to get Southampton to marry his either niece or granddaughter. I can't remember which one. And it's interesting because Southampton, I think, comes from, and we discuss this in terms of Paulina from The Winter's Tale, this woman, Magdalen Montague, that it's thought is the inspiration for the character of Paulina. And they were kind of opposing families. So, like, the Cecils were the family that were introducing the oath of supremacy and these types of, they were really pushing a lot of the religious crackdowns and things. Whereas the Montague family was, what's his name? The first Viscount Montague, he stood up in Parliament and verbally opposed the Act of Supremacy and multiple times fought for its removal or fought for it to never be instituted. So it was like, taking two families and marrying them through the children. So have Earl of Southampton and this Cecil girl marry. And Southampton refused. And he refused to the point that he had to pay this gigantic fine because of it. And he actually had to sell off some of his family's properties, their assets, in order to pay the fine. So he was diametrically opposed to the idea of marrying this woman. Now, it is thought that he was gay as well, which could be part of the reason why he didn't want to marry.
Typical British oligarchy.
But there's a lot of, it was like this big thing that was happening at the time. So it seems that these sonnets that Shakespeare's writing, he's writing on this subject that Southampton's kind of struggling with at the time. So that's why a lot of these early sonnets have, they're these arguments for, having offspring, whether, just be this simple idea of marrying, having children, but also, as was brought up last week, the idea of, producing children of the mind, producing works that you can leave behind. So a lot of these early sonnets can have that kind of double meaning to them. Anyway, so yeah, Sonnet 6 is definitely worth looking at in relation to Sonnet 5. So let's Let's look a little more closely at Sonnet 5. Any specific things that stand out or people like about it or don't like or are confused about? Actually, one of the first things, let's look for inversions in the iambic.
Okay.
So just looking at that first word of every line, what inversions do we have?
Beauty, I think, is one of them. Is if I'm reading it right.
Yep. Yeah, you wouldn't say beauty. Beauty or snowed and ban this everywhere. Beauty, yeah, beauty or snowed. Beauty's effect.
To hideous winter. Is that one?
So what, you'd say you'd emphasize the two?
Well, something would have to be rearranged, because it's to hideous winter.
Read those two lines from Never Resting Time and show me which syllable you'd emphasize.
From where?
For never resting time.
Yeah. For never resting time leads summer on to hideous winter. It seems like you'd have to change it right there. Or maybe he just makes hideous a two-syllable word right there.
So which syllable of hideous are you saying you would emphasize? It's what, 3 syllables, hideous. So which?
Well, if you emphasize hid and us, then you would have to invert winter, because it's not winter. But maybe it makes more sense just to have hideous as a two-syllable.
Yeah.
Hideous winter. Hideous winter, and confounds him there.
Yeah, that works. Yeah, because the hid, like in terms of an inversion, we're just looking mainly at the first words of each, or the first foot of each line. So the first foot of that line would be to hid, and it's to hid is winter. So it's already, the hid's already on the downbeat, on the dum. But yeah, that's the es being one syllable, I think is a very good point. To hid, yes, winter, and yeah, and then the emphasis falls on winter, the win of winter.
I think also sap checked.
Yep. Well,
it would be.
That's an interesting. Yep. Go for it. What were you gonna say?
No, just like it would be sap checked. It would be sap checked. That's all.
But isn't the word checked also important? Because when you're saying you're checking something, what does that mean?
I know, but it just to me it wouldn't. My first impulse was it wouldn't sound right.
Yeah, no, you're right. You're right. But you have to also figure out how to use checked as well, which kind of breaks all our rules here. Except, what do you notice about sap checked with frost?
Checked with frost, they're all monosyllable.
Exactly.
Monosyllabic. Yeah.
Exactly. So you can use sap and you can use checked.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Yep. Because, yeah, you definitely want to hear sap, because if you're just hearing checked with frost, you're like, well, what's checked with frost? What are you talking about? Was your finger checked with frost? Like, was it your toe? No, sap. Sap is checked with frost. The sap of the trees. Yeah, but obviously you need to hear the word checked as well, because it'd be the same thing. Sap with frost. You're like, what? What happened to the sap? Sap's checked with frost. So sap checked with frost. And, it's just as I said, it's monosyllabic series. You have to just consciously make some decisions about how you're going to navigate through the line and, kind of test some different hypotheses. And the best thing with all of these sonnets, when you're working on sonnets, obviously the first thing is you got to memorize it. If you don't have it memorized, it's almost, if you really want to figure out all the nuances of a sonnet, you really got to memorize it and own it. You got to memorize it to the point where you don't even have to think about the words. And it takes a bit of work to get to that point. Actually, I had fun with Chance once, because he did that sonnet, No Time Thou Shalt Not Boast That I Do Change. And he worked, I think it was the first sonnet he worked on. He did so much work on it, but I really pushed him to make sure he had it memorized, and we would memorize the sonnets, and then we would just read them as fast as possible, right? No time thou shalt not boast that I do change. Thy pyramids to me build up, blah, blah, I don't remember it. But, so he had got it so well memorized, and I was like, all right, let me see just how well memorized it is. So while he was reading it, I handed him a book, and I said, turn to page 76 and keep reciting. And he was able to open the book, flick through the pages, read the page numbers, and find the page without skipping a beat in reciting his sonnet. And I was like, oh, okay, I'm pretty convinced that you've got it, you kind of know it like the back of your hand now.
Wow.
Because when you know it that well, then you have the freedom to just, to kind of play with the sonnet. Because it's always, when you're kind of struggling to remember what the next line is, it's very difficult to, to pay any attention to what the actual content of the sonnet is. So that was fun. But when working on the sonnets, record yourself reciting them. It's very useful to record it and then go back and see, because the other thing is that what we think is coming out of our mouth in a certain way, and then when we go back and listen to it and what we actually hear, it's usually something completely different. And when we first started doing all the drama work, it was when we actually really instituted recording the sessions, and then instituted that people had, as part of the homework, people had to go back and watch it. Then we were able to start kind of making all these leaps that just didn't exist previously. Because you'd come away from the session and you'd have a sense of what you thought happened in it, but you would forget half of the notes Robert gave you anyway.
Right.
So going back and listening to it and taking notes is very useful. But anyways. So, okay, what else about this sonnet? Let's have a look. It's got a then in there, which I had not been conscious of. The then. Like when we're talking about all these when, and then in these other sonnets, it's got the then. And obviously there's a sense of time, so those hours. And he's talking about those hours. So those hours that with gentle work did frame the lovely gaze where every eye doth dwell, those hours will play the tyrants to the very same. And that unfair, actually I would say that that's an inversion on the unfair, because there's a counterpoint between unfair and fair. And in the case of the iambic, and that unfair which fairly doth excel. So the un is not falling on the stress. But that's a spot where I would think it has to be broken. So those hours will play the tyrants to the very same, and that unfair which fairly doth excel. So those hours that have been fairly excelling and producing this, this beautiful frame that's been done with gentle work, and it's so beautiful that everybody's gazing on it. Those same hours are going to play the tyrants and are going to unfairly destroy everything that they so fairly created. It's kind of a tongue twister. And then obviously he's explaining why, right? Because never resting time leads summer, which you can say is this beautiful time of year, on to hideous winter, and yet hideous is a fun word. So it's not just leads it on to winter, but leads it on to hideous winter and confounds him there. Now, what does confounds mean? Confounds. Oh, wasted, destroy. Bring to ruin or perdition. Waste, consume, spend. Mingle so that the elements become indistinguishable.
That's confound.
Yeah.
Used back then or something? Or?
Yeah, I'm reading. This is from the Shakespeare glossary by C.T. Onions. It's a very, very, very good glossary that's just based on, definitions that Shakespeare would have used back then. Not definitions. Yeah, the definitions of words that they would have been using back then. Is there a modern definition of confound? Oh, cause surprise or confusion in someone, especially by acting against their expectations. Mixed.
Yeah, I've heard the, confounded, typical British expression of surprise.
Mix up with something else. Yep. So I think in this context, he's definitely talking about destruction, waste, decay. So time is leading summer on to hideous winter and confounds him there. And then it's just a description of it, right? So sap is checked with frost. So it's frozen in place. Lusty leaves quite gone. All the trees have lost their leaves. Beauty, or snowed, and bareness everywhere. Then, and this is the part that's a little bit difficult because there's this not that's in there, so it's making it a negative. Then we're not summer's distillation left. So if summer's distillation was not left as a liquid prisoner pent in walls of glass, so I guess that would be like, well, I don't know. What do people think of that? A liquid prisoner pent in walls of glass.
Is he talking about the sap?
Yeah,
the sap being summer's distillation?
Yeah, that's where it's interesting because it is. I don't know what exactly is the act of distillation.
Well, that's
to filter something. So it's. Let me look it up. I think it's to filter. Process of separating component substances from liquid mixtures through vaporization. So it's basically the process of heating a liquid until it boils, then condensing and collecting the resultant hot vapors. Yes.
So if a flower was distilled, would that be like a perfume? Or something?
I know it's a method of purification.
Maybe it's nectar or something.
What was that, John?
It's nectar?
See, it's interesting. Osaka was working on this sonnet for a little while, and we'd had some discussion about this. And I'd kind of thought it was the sap. But she had brought up like this idea of when you distill something.
Mhm.
Well, and yeah, I don't know. I'm still confused on this exact in terms of having a specific idea, but because the next sonnet talks about the vial, filling some vial, as in like an actual little, glass vial. Um, you know, I don't know. We had more of the idea then that it is literally walls of glass, or I don't know. It's just a little. That once you distill something, you're obviously going to be collecting it in a bottle.
Yeah.
But, is he talking about nature's act of distillation, or, obviously putting something in a bottle, that's an act that man is doing. So, yeah, is it just the sap that's frozen in the walls of glass, or the, like walls of ice that the sap's checked inside, which I think probably makes the most sense. But then he's saying, but flowers distilled, though they with winter meet least, but they show their substance still lives sweet. So is it, and I guess that's what you're saying, John, maybe the nectar of a flower becomes the thing that gets distilled?
Yeah, I was thinking that, yeah. I mean, it doesn't, not by boiling necessarily, but by extracting it.
Oh, I think, like, these flowers in winter, they get covered in snow, so they get covered in, like, their purity is caught up in this glass wall. So in a sense, that's the end product of distillation. It's basically the pure liquid collected in a glass jar or flask. So flowers distilled, though they with winter meet. So in winter, it means that the flowers they're distilled. They're not. Their beauty is just trapped for now, temporarily.
So the substance is still living, even though it's in a distilled form. And once winter leaves, summer will return. Yeah.
I never have heard of that, but that's interesting.
Yeah, because I mean, you think about it, and it's funny because in Australia you don't have at least where I'm from in Australia, you don't have as distinct seasons as what I have experienced here in the east coast of the U.S. Like most of the trees in Australia, they're evergreens. They don't lose their leaves, right? We don't, we call it autumn. It's called fall here, but that's because the leaves actually fall from the tree. That doesn't really happen that much in Australia.
Right.
So spring here is always kind of actually, and it's funny because I was in Australia recently, and when I went to Australia, it was still winter here. But when I came back, everything had already bloomed, and all the trees were fully, had all their their foliage back and stuff, and it was shocking because I remember, because I came home late at night, and then when I woke up the next morning, just even in the house, like the amount of light coming in the windows and things, I was like, hang on, everything just seems completely different. And it was when I looked outside and realized that all the trees had leaves on them. And I was like, oh yeah, that's right. When I left, none of these had leaves. So it's, even though the winter is coming and kind of creating this bareness, it's not being destroyed. Right? These trees, actually, and that's the funny thing, like when you see trees in Australia that don't have leaves, it's usually because they're dead. But, through winter when everything becomes kind of drab and dreary and there's no leaves, all you need is spring to come along and it all reblooms. So,
right.
And that's where he's saying then we're not, if this was not the case, if summer's distillation wasn't left a liquid prisoner pent in walls of glass, then beauty's effect and beauty with beauty, so beauty's effect and beauty itself were bereft, nor it, nor no remembrance what it was. So it would just be wiped out. And he's saying,
right.
but flowers distilled, Though they with winter meet, least but their show, their substance still lives sweet. So it's interesting because in this sonnet, it's like he's kind of attacking time in a sense, right? Never resting time leads summer on to hideous winter and confounds him there. But by the end of it, he's actually referencing to the fact that beauty is not being destroyed, that it's just being distilled, and it can be renewed. So it's not all doom and gloom.